Voila. Dear friends and family of Sandy Baird, Sandra Louise Baird. Well, I don't know how to start. This Sunday, like 3 years, even more than that, Sandy and I met in 2012 when she was at Burlington College. I was running away from a career as a broadcaster for the Voice of America. Oh my God, could you be a journalist for the Voice of America? Sandy told me. And also I was covering a conflict in my own country, the Ivory Coast, where I discovered what are the real powers and people that are creating those conflicts and for what. So I was pissed. I was looking for a place to reinvent myself. And I went back to Atlanta to try to be hired by the newsroom over there. They said, we want you covering conflicts. I went back to the Voice of America. My former colleagues were dying, cancer, not all sad because of the subprime crisis. So I remember that in 2001, I was doing a reportage in the desert of Mali. Robert Plant from Led Zeppelin was playing at a festival, so I was sent there to cover the festival. And I met with a young Vermonter, Noah Fishman, who owns Zen Barn in Waterbury. And Noah was like on a sabbatical year. He talked about Vermont. What is this place? And then, but when we were about to return to the US, Noah didn't have enough money at the airport to pay for excess luggage. He was coming back with drums and, teenagers. So I had the fat government credit card because I was traveling with that Citibank card from the US government. So I gave him the money and then he sent me a check. 2 weeks later, I saw a check on my desk in Washington with an invitation to come to Vermont by his mother, Susan Fisherman Baird, who probably said, I might have a son who's lost in the desert over there, so come, I see you, maybe, So I came to Vermont and I fell in love with Vermont. For the first time, I locked a door in Vermont. And people were, how can you lock that? So I discovered Vermont, and when in 2012, I needed to reinvent myself, looking for somewhere to start afresh, I thought of coming to Vermont. To make it short, then I met with Sandy and Robin Lloyd, Jacob Beaugré. They were having a seminar at Burlington College about Africa and its politics. So I was welcome to come and rant about how the US and the Soviet Union, blah, 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 was colonial powers were taking advantage of Africa. And then Sandy and I developed that friendship through Robin Lloyd, who just arrived, my queen Robin. So Robin is here, a long friend also. I see both as, two faces of the same token. I said, Robin, you are a power flower, and Sandy is a knight with a sword. And then Sandy, when after 2 or 3 years in Burlington, I couldn't find my way still because I was coming from Washington. Couldn't convince people that I was a reporter. That I went to to work for Voice of America. I couldn't be something else but a refugee. So I said, listen, I'll go back to Africa, work for the African Union, and come back. So in 2019, Sandy said, with Robin, you're not going nowhere. We sit here. Since then, she held my hand and walked me through Vermont. I met so beautiful people. Peter Clavel, my big brother over there, Barry, Steve Goodkind, and all kinds of folks that made me today willing to be a US citizen. Because back in the days, I refused to be a US citizen because I thought I could serve my country. And I went back, it didn't go well. I was too American now for them. So today, it's not just someone with whom I worked, someone who inspired me. Sandy was herself a first generation American. So she knows how important it is to keep that, 14th Amendment, to make sure that each kid that is born here is American and is entitled to equity, to be called a citizen of this country. And for that, I admire, we're like an old couple, people will say, fighting every day, who doesn't know Sandy? Who doesn't know Sandy? Sometimes we broke up like many times. And then she will call you the following day like if nothing happened. Eric! Because during the night she had another idea. Bah, bah. I have ADHD. I know I discovered that when I was 50 years old. But I think Sandy, that's so. So imagine two ADHD people in the same room. Bah, 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 bah. But to make it short, today, a week before this happened, she drove with you, came. We borrowed, Grant's car. We drove down all the way to Montpellier because she wanted to meet with the AG.
Charity Clark.
Yes. So because she wanted this to be a talk that will tell people about how we must protect this right. And Sandy drove there. We went there. We met with the people. That day, Becca Ballant was also giving a talk. So we closed the deal, and then we are glad. We are glad because the AG's office, sent us a gentleman who was also, a brilliant gentleman who will talk about this. Ryan Kane is. I didn't have to look at my. Is a deputy solicitor. I don't know what it means, but probably is the second number 2 over there. So at the Vermont Attorney General's office, as part of his role, Ryan, I hope I'm not saying something wrong, has been involved in significant appellate work, including presenting arguments at the Vermont Supreme Court, the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, and participating in amicus briefs. Yeah. Before the U.S. Supreme Court. His expertise will provide tonight an invaluable insight into the complexities of constitutional law as it relates to the rights of immigrants and their families in America. So this is not an official tribute to Sandy, but I wanted to be special, to have all of you around her because she didn't like Zoom. She wanted us to be here. So you all are here for Sandy, Baird. This is Ryan Kane.
Well, thank you very much. It is an honor to be here and speak with you tonight. And I know Attorney General Clark sends her regards and was really excited for somebody from the office to be able to come and speak at this event. And it's only gained more meaning with Sandy's recent passing. So I'm Ryan Kane. I'm the Deputy Solicitor General within the Vermont Attorney General's office, and we oversee all of the appeals work on behalf of the state. But importantly, especially right now, we also oversee all federal-related litigation on behalf of the state of Vermont, which includes, challenging actions taken by the federal government that are contrary to the state's interests and contrary to the laws and the Constitution of the United States. Every Assistant Attorney General, the Attorney General himself, takes an oath of office, which includes an oath to uphold the Constitution of the United States. And so it's a really important role for state attorneys general to do that, to serve that function in upholding the Constitution when the federal government takes actions that states believe are contrary to the U.S. Constitution, which this current administration certainly has done. And one of the very first things they did on January 20th, our Inauguration Day, one of those many executive orders was this attempt to revoke the constitutionally protected privilege of birthright citizenship, which has been part of the fabric of the United States since the founding. So I was asked to come and speak just a little bit generally about what birthright citizenship is, how it's enshrined in the Constitution. I certainly welcome any questions, have this be a conversation. I don't even want to hear myself talk for 20 minutes, so feel free to interrupt the questions if you have anything as things come up. But foundationally, the birthright citizenship, as I said, is enshrined in the Constitution. It's in the 14th Amendment, which was passed after the Civil War, but it actually predates that in American jurisprudence. American law, common law, traces back to England. And so the U.S. Constitution doesn't specify anything about who becomes citizens of the United States, and it was a matter of common law. And so the United States has always followed the English rule of what they call jus soli, which is the Latin for of the soil, where your citizenship is determined based on the land that you're born in and the jurisdiction you're under. And that was codified in the 14th Amendment, which states absolutely clearly, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. That's it. That's the language of the 14th Amendment, and we think it's clear. And so far, multiple federal judges have also thought it's clear and issued temporary restraining orders and preliminary injunctive relief, which has stopped the implementation of the executive order, which attempted to rescind this bedrock principle of American law. Now, the reason that language was included in the 14th Amendment actually came out of a very dark period in American jurisprudence. The Dred Scott v. Sanford case by the U.S. Supreme Court, which I think any Supreme Court scholar, if they have a list of the worst decisions the U.S. Supreme Court has ever issued, if it's not on the top of the list, then I don't think know what they're talking about, because it's clearly just based on not only the impact of the decision and the overt racism of the decision, but just the legal analysis. It's just an awful decision. It was an attempt by the U.S. Supreme Court to try to maybe avert the Civil War by acceding to the South and declaring that slavery was legal in the United States, and that any individuals of African descent were not citizens of the United States and were not intended to be citizens under the Constitution. It's just like I said, it's just an awful decision. And certainly, 4 years later, the Civil War starts and the history of that played out. But in the Reconstruction, the adoption of the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, was also accompanied with the adoption of the 14th Amendment, which made clear that every individual who is born in the United States is a citizen of the United States. So but as I said, that dates back to the English common law, which also had the same principle. And it's common. There's many, many countries throughout the world have this same, whenever something traced back to Latin, it's not just like some one-off thing. The jus soli is like a very old principle. And it's not the only one. There are many European countries have different forms of citizenship based on different factors, but the English rule and the American rule has always been that any individual who's born within the jurisdiction of the United States is a citizen thereof. So that's kind of the overview of that. The Trump administration, in their executive order, pulled a few words out of the 14th Amendment, the language that subject to the jurisdiction thereof, and attempted to contort those words to meaning something other than what they've always meant, which is you're here, you're subject to the jurisdiction of the United States, to somehow try to reinterpret those words to look at not the child that was born, who is obviously subject to the laws and protections of the United States, but the parents and their legal status, and to say that anybody who's here, who's not a lawful permanent resident, that their children somehow are not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. Which also goes contrary to very long-standing precedent of the U.S. Supreme Court. In 1893, there was a U.S. Supreme Court case, 1898, United States v. Wong Kim Ark, which was the first interpretation of the 14th Amendment, this language of the 14th Amendment. It dealt with a Chinese national living in San Francisco. And the Supreme Court didn't have much difficulty in saying the plain language of the 14th Amendment means what it says, which is any individual born within the jurisdiction of the United States, here on our soil, jus soli, as a citizen of the United States. And it did articulate and expand on that language of subject to the jurisdiction thereof, and it gave some examples from the time of individuals who wouldn't be subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. At the time, under federal law, Native Americans were not necessarily automatic citizens of the United States. They were citizens of their individual tribes that they were born to. The tribes were considered to be independent sovereigns. The law has changed now based on federal statute, so that's no longer the case, but that was one example. A foreign adversary, if we were, invaded by another country who's here, in some sort of military conflict, they're obviously not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. They're here unlawfully in some sort of, adversarial capacity. So those individuals certainly are not part of our country. And then the third example that was given is, foreign diplomats or the children of foreign diplomats. And I always think back to I think it was like Lethal Weapon or Die Hard. There's some 80s action movie that has burned into my head somehow, where the bad guy is zooming around in a sports car, and there's we can't do anything because they're a foreign diplomat and they're not subject to the laws of the United States. That's literally what it means. If you're a diplomat here that is not subject to our jurisdiction, your children are not automatically citizens because you're not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. That's what the court said in Wong Kim Ark. And so it's been established precedent based on that case for hundreds of years that those are the situations in which someone might not have birthright citizenship. So it's this attempt to kind of rewrite the Constitution in order to change federal policy is certainly not new, and this isn't the only instance in which this administration is attempting to do that. But this was just a particularly egregious one, and it just doesn't make sense, right? Obviously, the people who are here are subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. The executive order is not clear really on how it expects these infants and children born here to be treated. But fundamentally, it's also I kind of lost my train of thought. I apologize. It doesn't articulate how they're supposed to be treated, but it also attempts to classify people based on the laws of the United States. It says if you're here as a lawful permanent resident, which is part of the immigration laws that dictates who is what, or if you're here as a lawful but temporary resident under a student visa or other a work visa, that somehow then dictates whether you're entitled to birthright citizenship or not. So the fact that the executive order itself points to classifications made under U.S. federal law to determine whether or not they think you're subject to the jurisdiction thereof indicates that obviously there's if you're using U.S. law to make this determination, then the people that you're making the determination about are subject to U.S. law. So they're very specious arguments. The judge there's two cases that different states have filed. A group of Democratic attorneys general, including Vermont, within 24 hours of the executive order, filed suit in the District of Massachusetts. The state of Washington and Oregon and one other, I think, don't quote me on that. There might be different states. Sorry, Oregon, it's not you. Filed in the District of Washington. And the Washington judge dealt with it a little earlier, but it was very clear. So this is the most clearly unconstitutional thing I've ever seen in my 20 plus years on the federal bench. So judges around the country have come forward and just said that this is clearly contrary to the Constitution and contrary to this important bedrock principle that's underscored the entirety of the United States, that every person who's born here is entitled to citizenship and the protection of the laws.
Have any of the sitting members of the U.S. Supreme Court written on the subject, law review articles years ago?
Not that I'm aware of. I haven't looked at it. Again, there haven't been a ton of cases post Wong Kim Ark, and I think another one that's eluding my memory right now that have dealt with birthright citizenship at the U.S. Supreme Court. There's certainly a number of circuit decisions. I don't believe any of the current justices had dealt with any of these issues while on lower courts of appeals, but
I'm talking during the misspent years.
yeah, yeah, right. Not that I'm aware of, but I don't know. That's not something I've looked into, but yeah, I mean, it'll be interesting. That's a good question to think whether this issue will even reach the U.S. Supreme Court. You know, as a matter of practice, the U.S. Supreme Court only is supposed to be taking cases that involve, you know, splits of decisions among the circuit courts of appeals or a conflict in law. So it's a hope that that there's not going to be much dispute among the lower courts as to the plain language and applicability of the 14th Amendment, such that the U.S. Supreme Court has no real reason to take this up on certiorari. But if they do, then that'll signal an indication that the court's looking to make a change. But again, it's just such a settled area of law and such a clear, just the language of the 14th Amendment itself is so clear that I'm hopeful that this one won't lead to an opportunity for the U.S. Supreme Court to address the issue.
So Ryan, you can carry on, and then later, Jared. No. If you
That's more or less the.
Come grab a seat.
Yeah, sure. And then I'll. This is good because then all your questions I can pose to Jared instead. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
That was great.
Jared, you want to go?
Start, Eric?
Yeah, go ahead.
And there was a question over here too.
The case of 1898, who brought that case? The United States government against an individual? The state against an individual?
I think they sued.
I think they were engaged. Yeah, they sued over something, and the question was whether or not. So I don't think so. It wasn't the U.S. government didn't bring a case against the individual. It was, and this was what happened in the Dred Scott case too. It wasn't like the initial question was or not, does this person have citizenship? It was somebody's trying to use the courts to protect their rights. And throughout that litigation, a court said, we don't actually have to resolve your dispute because you're not a proper party here because you're not a citizen, so you can't avail yourselves of the courts. And I'm pretty sure that's what happened in the Wonkemar case, but and so
wasn't
then
the McKinley administration or something trying to
not that I
do the same thing.
He was denied entry.
That's
He
right.
went to visit his parents in China. He came back. He was denied entry, and then he ended up suing.
Okay, thank you. I've been looking at
the government did try to
They blocked him from re-entering.
yeah.
When he tried to come back, and then he sued, I think, claiming that he was a citizen. He'd been born there. So that's interesting. So one just briefly, one of the things, and I know there'll be other opportunities, of course, to share our love and appreciation for Sandy. But one of the things, having done many of these with her, when Sandy would moderate, usually Sandy was more expert than any of the moderators. And so you all might recall that she had very powerful views on many of these things, including this one. So I am definitely not more of an expert on this than you are. So I'll try to navigate all of that and still make it hopefully an interesting conversation. I think one of the things that comes to mind when I think about this is, I guess, sort of foundationally, like, why is this important? Why is birthright citizenship, do you think, important? You know, policy reasons, legal reasons. Why does this matter?
I think it matters one, because of just the history of our country. This has been a part of our nation since its founding, as part of the English common law, even before that. You need to have some rule that dictates who is a citizen of the country. And I think the rule of jus soli, that where you're born, you're a citizen of, is just is such a clear rule, and it's just represents both the joint relationship between somebody who's born in a country and the government thereof, that they're become part of the society, they're under the protection of and get the benefits of the government, but also, you know, certainly under English common law, it was like you have your allegiance to the king, and was part of it, so that your allegiance to the sovereignty and the sovereign's duty to protect you is just such a fundamental relationship. And I think it's just so important as we think of, newborn babies, infants, some of the most vulnerable in our communities, our lives, that they should be entitled to that protection and that relationship and the support that comes from being a citizen of the United States. And the contrary rule, I think, just goes against some of those foundational principles. That
Is there like a slippery, like if the Supreme Court were to decide that this language and subject to the jurisdiction thereof means something other than you're here, like what is the practical implications of that?
Yeah, I mean, again, that's what I don't know, and that's why so many of these executive orders were not particularly well thought through or particularly clear as far as what the actual implications would be. So, yeah, I mean, we don't have another rule,
Right.
And so many of these people are people coming to this country, fleeing, as refugees, fleeing some of the most terrible conditions on the planet. And so it's not like a lot of Europe, like I say, has different rules that go through, your father. Traditionally, historically, it was always the father in our patriarchal society history. But that's what dictated it, in European countries. But it's just, we're such a different place than that.
So what's I guess, like, if it's so clear on its face, like the law says what it means, then how can these lawyers get up and make these arguments?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a question I think that the Washington district judge posed directly to the DOJ attorneys who were there.
I mean, potentially penalties for them? If
Probably not. I mean, it's like there are rules and ethical obligations that you can't bring something that's clearly not meritorious, just like that's used to harass. So, it's a very, very, very bad argument, but I don't think it crosses that line that's very hard to cross as far as...
Are they saying that it's like... I mean, I don't know what Trump has said. I don't know if the executive order gets into that, but do they make this argument this is somehow like an invasion? I mean, Trump uses those words when he talks about people coming in.
Yeah.
Is that like at the heart of what they're trying to say?
They haven't, I don't think. But that's not, they certainly are. And there was talk leading up to the inauguration of the Alien Enemies Act, which really is it's a whole different thing, and it hasn't really actually been invoked or used, but is a law that's specifically targeted at foreign invaders, another sovereign country attempting to invade the territorial limits of the United States. And they were suggesting some attempt to use that to call all, criminal migrants as somehow subject under the Aliens Enemy Act. So this notion,
if they have jurisdiction over them that way, how are they not subject to the jurisdiction?
Yeah,
it seems circular.
Right, exactly. It is circular for sure. But I'm surprised that hasn't been exactly how they've articulated it. Yeah. But they essentially just want to rewrite and expand that language, which again the language is what it is from the Constitution. Courts, as a fundamental rule, are supposed to apply the law wherever the plain language of the law is clear and the intent of the drafters of that law is unambiguous. Courts have no role but to enforce the law and apply it to the facts. But certainly the Wonkamar case does do some interpretation of that language. Right. The U.S. Supreme Court certainly could overrule that and reinterpret subject to the jurisdiction thereof. But as I said, it's really hard to figure out or articulate what that line would be that would allow for lawful permanent right. Yeah, and exactly.
Barry?
Just before, the words "or naturalized" are just before subject to jurisdiction. Well, I think there have been cases where naturalized citizens were stripped of their citizenship. And I think that's what happened with Emma Goldman. I know there was, I remember there was an ultra-Zionist rabbi who was also a citizen. I think he was even in the Knesset in Israel. Mm-hmm. And there was a court case about whether or not he should.
Did they commit like fraud on their naturalization applications? Was that what happened? I don't know the case, but.
This was a born American. In fact, I think he was a born American citizen. I mean, if an American citizen, I think under existing case law,
Right.
if I stand up and say I have allegiance to New Zealand,
Right.
you Americans can go. Right.
The U.S., like a lot of countries, I don't think recognizes dual citizenship.
Well,
So,
the U.S. does. apparently.
well, you have to enter in and out on your U.S. passport. But I think
Yeah.
I don't know the exact case you're talking about. But
Mahoney or something like that?
my recollection is though that if you commit fraud or lie on your naturalization papers, then the citizenship was essentially granted improvidently and it can be taken away.
I believe this was someone who was born in the United States. And when I was thinking of Emma Goldman
Right.
first,
Yeah.
I believe she was a naturalized citizen,
Right.
and then they took hers away.
Right.
And I think it might be worth looking
Right.
into cases of naturalized citizens losing their citizenship
Right.
and see if an argument
Right.
will be coming from the other side.
Right. That they are somehow have
Expand on
allegiances to other countries and so are not subject to
Yeah.
jurisdiction of. The problem with that is like I don't know how you can make a straight face argument that anybody here in this country is not subject to the jurisdiction of this country without conceding that, does that mean these people can't be arrested for committing crimes because they're outside of the jurisdiction or whatever other, I mean, it seems to me that it doesn't pass the laugh test, but.
In fact, if a person from another country who's not a citizen,
Right.
even if they're illegal,
Right.
even if they are undocumented, aren't
Right.
they subject to Social Security and taxation?
Yeah.
Well,
Right.
that does it.
Well, and I think I don't know what your thoughts on this, but I always wonder, particularly with Donald Trump, whether this is just as much about making a political statement to some portion of his supporters as it is an actual legal argument. And that's why I kind of come back to like, how can the lawyers get up and do this, make these arguments?
Yeah. No, I mean, so I think they do try to articulate some finer distinction on like subject to some forms of regulation being different from subject to the jurisdiction thereof. And they talk about the like Native American tribes, how the U.S. government has always exercised some authority and control, even at the time of the Wong-Kim-Ark case, over the Native tribes. And so they say, you know, we regulate all kinds of things with respect to people, but those people under Wong-Kim-Ark are not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States, and therefore it doesn't necessarily mean subject to the laws thereof. It means maybe something different. But it's like as soon as you try to dig into that more and actually articulate a rule by which you would determine who is who, it starts to fall apart. And they just say it's, you know, the people we don't want, you know, and it's just like so. But to your point about the speciousness of these arguments, there was in I think both cases a group of Republican attorneys general who joined in amicus briefs on behalf of the federal government in support of this this argument. So there are lawyers who are willing to do it, and I think there's certainly a political side to it. There's also just they want the Constitution to say what they want it to say, not what it says, which is particularly ironic given how.
Can it trump the Constitution?
Of course not. No, that's key. And so much of like thinking about all the other litigation that we've been involved in, the budget funding freeze litigation that's happening in Rhode Island over the, you know, blanket executive order and OMB directive that attempted to freeze all federal funding. It's just like it just is such a total disregard for the Constitution. Mm-hmm. Any scholar, anybody who even looks at any fundamental like constitutional law stuff understands the separation of powers. You know, Congress has the power of the purse. Congress is the one who gets to decide how taxpayers' money is spent. That's just foundational. and the executive branch doesn't. It's just not their role. They can't impound funds. They can't say, oh yeah, Congress, you want us to spend money on that? Well, I don't really want to, so I'm not going to. It's just foundational law that that's the case, and yet they've tried to do that in many different situations. So it really is a situation where, despite the Republican Party platforming on devotion to the Constitution and we are here to support the Constitution, that's really only the parts of the Constitution that they like. And if they don't like it, then they're happy to try to rewrite it or just fundamentally ignore it.
Steve, I know you're.
I'm curious. The 14th Amendment doesn't mention parentage at all, correct? It just says you're born here.
Exactly.
It doesn't say who your parents are, whether they're citizens or not.
Correct.
I'm just thinking, I mean,
All persons
people
born
who
and
came to
naturalized
this
in the United
country, like,
States
say,
and
200 years
subject to
ago,
thereof.
never went through a naturalization process or whatever, and then their offspring, by this Trump thought, wouldn't be citizens, and you can have people that are like 10 generations that aren't citizens, they don't even know it.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and immigration laws have changed dramatically and had, so yeah, there's exactly. And that's fundamental too. I mean, again, the language is clear. All persons born subject to the jurisdiction. It doesn't mention the parents at all.
Exactly.
It has
That isn't the
no
case.
reference
The whole thing
whatsoever.
could be a complete
Yeah, and as soon
mess.
as you start to look at them, then it's like, so we're going to go back and try to.
Did your great-grandparents ever get naturalized? or
Yeah,
not?
yeah,
Or-
exactly.
And then
How ironic it is that Melania was not a citizen when she gave birth to Baird.
Sure.
So.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, but her father was. Her father was.
Yeah, but still.
parentage is not it's not mentioned at all. Parentage
Yeah,
is not a
Right.
Yeah, there's another interesting case, Filer v. Doe, which was a U.S. Supreme Court case that looked at sort of a similar issue in some ways in the 14th Amendment and this definition of jurisdiction. In that case, I think it was Texas, didn't want to allow, and I'm probably oversimplifying, didn't want to allow undocumented children to attend public schools. And the court said that that violated the 14th Amendment, and it interpreted that jurisdiction language in a slightly different provision. But I think there's a strong argument to be made that that same logic would apply here. And they said that Texas couldn't do that as a result. And the other thing is, I think I read, and this isn't the exact, don't quote me on this exact statistic, but there's something like, if this was to go into effect over the course of the next month, there's 150,000 children that would be born to undocumented folks who would therefore not have citizenship, not be able to get social security numbers, not be able to get, all of the things that go along with being, with birthright citizenship, right? All the rights and privileges that go along with it. So it really would have a dramatic impact on people, not just historically, but moving forward as well.
Yeah, and that's part of, for any lawsuit, the parties to the lawsuit have to have standing. They have to be able to show they have a concrete interest in the outcome, which means that they would be injured potentially by the actions taken. And so, the states are always concerned about or looking at how do we establish standing, how do we establish an injury to the states. And this one's easy because an economic injury, having to spend money that you wouldn't otherwise have to spend, is pretty clear, cut and dry injury. And, Vermont said, and all these other states said, if the federal government isn't going to consider these infants citizens anymore, then they're not going to be eligible for all this federal funding that's like on a per capita basis for, educational services, for, these public supports. Vermont's not going to, let infants starve or not. So it's like, we're going to have to come up with the money to front those bills to take care of these people. And so, but it just goes to, again, the purpose of this, the fundamental nature of it, as being like protective of these newborn infants who are born here, through certainly no fault of their own.
I believe regardless what the president wants to do or not, it doesn't work. Because if non-documented couples have a baby today, they are not in the hospital or when they go register that baby. There is no practicality to ask, hey, give me your birthday to the parents.
Yeah.
Or who is your parents?
Yeah.
Who are your parents? It doesn't work this way.
Right.
The moment it will work this way, half of this nation or more doesn't have a passport. They don't carry their birth certificates. So it will be chaos by itself.
Absolutely.
So it's not going to work.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
And I want to like just jump on that because we all saw videos of people being deported, put on these planes that cost billions of dollars of our taxpayers' money. And how likely it is for ICE just to come and scoop you up and deport you immediately? Is there a due process? Are people entitled to public defenders, like in criminal court and things like that?
Oh, I'm not an expert in immigration law,
Okay.
but we could talk. Yeah.
Nathan is here, so Nathan, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, so let me just close this. It's tough, obviously. And thank you guys, obviously. Of course. So they're essential. So first thing is no, you're not entitled to a public defender. Unfortunately, in immigration law, you do not have the right to an attorney. You have the ability to hire one if you want, or get a pro bono, but it's not a right, unfortunately, like criminal law. As far as due process, generally yes, but that is being challenged as well. So, if you've heard of expedited removal, that's essentially stripping you of what would have been your due process. So that is being challenged, unfortunately. It happens, and maybe Mike can speak more to this. If wrongful deportations happen, it would be really bad to try to do that because you're going to run into a lot of issues with supervisors, whatever the case is. But we're in a time where immigration laws have always been changing policies. Depending on the administration, those have been being challenged. Obviously, Trump is really trying to challenge every piece of immigration. It's bad, and a lot of people are spinning their heads, like Congress. We have the, judges that they've never been challenged in a way. So there may be a time where they have to try to identify or define certain meanings. So maybe they have to identify and put a hard set definition on subject to, which really never really had to define. So in detail. So it's changing. It's scary. It's an uncertain time. But we just advocates. We keep fighting. We're trying to do the right thing. Trying to protect people. I won't try to change this into a know your rights, but ALD we do those know your rights to try to educate people. The communities are undocumented folks, refugees, anybody who may, not even just them, even U.S. born citizens are being stopped by ICE. Doesn't necessarily mean you're thrown into removal proceedings, but people should just be prepared. So I don't want to go on a whole speech about it, but we are offering those know your rights so that you as a community can help people in those situations. I'll stop talking because I can talk about it forever. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Nathan.
Thank you. I mean, do you have any concerns? I mean, this Supreme Court has overruled things like Roe v. Wade. I mean, does that give you pause as somebody that argues appellate cases that, that maybe there's an appetite to overrule the Wong case or whatever?
I mean, sure. I think, anything of import getting up to the current U.S. Supreme Court gives me a little pause, given that, Roe v. Wade, one of the foundational cases in administrative law, Chevron deference, which has been the law for many decades, just gone, thrown kind of into chaos. So they're certainly not afraid to do that.
Right.
So it is strategically, as you think about federal litigation, it's something now that's important to try to consider when and how or if things reach the highest court in the country. Again, I mean, this one, I hope that there's unanimity amongst the lower courts on the meaning of the 14th Amendment and birthright citizenship, such that there's not a real opportunity to, but the U.S. Supreme Court, I shouldn't say that, they're not bound to only take cases where there's a circuit split or a difference of opinion.
Yeah.
But that's one of the leading kind of factors and reasons.
Besides suing, is there anything else that Vermont could do? Like, could Vermont have you're born in Vermont, you're a Vermont citizen, and therefore, I mean, I don't know, there's other creative ways that, like, I don't, what else could we do?
I don't know, not much. And this goes to the immigration question
Yeah.
more generally. So immigration, what we can do is what we've done, which is sue in federal court, say this is contrary to the Constitution, and use these bedrock principles of our government to hold the other branches accountable, checks and balances. But yeah, no, I mean, an immigration policy is fundamentally a matter of federal law. So there's really not a lot we can do to dictate immigration policy.
Right. What about some of obviously, like, the upshot here is if this were to be adopted, then all of these folks who were born to undocumented parents would therefore be undocumented and subject to deportation themselves to a place they've never lived.
Yeah.
I mean, I know I've read about some of the things Vermont does in terms of, like, the city of Burlington, passed ordinances that limit, I don't know what the right word is, but limit, like, Burlington Police Department's ability to collaborate with ICE. And I don't know, does Vermont have a similar policy at the state level, do you know, or a field of what, like, but
yeah.
I think it's all, like, related, and I think
Sure, definitely. No, I mean, and that is a good point, that if
fair policing policy.
the fair and impartial policing policy is certainly part of it. And that's maybe the clearest statewide policy that would govern the interplay between federal immigration enforcement and state resources. But yeah, no, that's a great point, that if this were followed, then it'd be even a bigger question, this already ongoing dispute as to, how much the federal government can co-opt or coerce state actors to perform immigration functions. And if you had this whole new class of newborns over who knows how long a period of time that were then subject to immigration enforcement or proceedings, it would, I think, exacerbate and certainly it would be very
Do you have
difficult.
any ideas, I don't know if there's any in the briefing or if anything, do you have any idea how many Vermonters are, like, are those numbers out there somewhere?
Yeah, probably. I didn't print the whole complaint, so I don't.
Okay.
I don't. It's
But there are
been a
obviously
busy few weeks. Yeah, there are. Yeah, I think we included some kind of real general numbers as far as, obviously we're not a big state here in Vermont, so, but which is also why it's super helpful to have these allies and other Democratic attorneys general that we were able to work with in states like California and Washington and New York and New Jersey and Massachusetts.
So what does it mean? And others ask questions too if you want. I'm just keeping it going here.
Yeah.
What does it mean that the federal courts have enjoined the federal government from doing?
Yeah, I mean, it's like
injunction mean?
Yeah, it's an order to stop. The courts have the authority to, order other branches of government to do or to not do things, or to rule that laws, declaratory relief, declare a law or an action or an order to be invalid. And so that usually you don't get that type of relief until a case is done with. You go through the whole process. The judge hears all the evidence or the arguments, however it shakes out, and then issues a final ruling and issues the relief. In cases where you can show that there's some risk of ongoing harm, irreparable harm that's not going to get fixed at the end of the case, you can go in early and ask the judge to do something before even reaching the final merits of the case. But it's like, and this points to just how serious these issues are and just how, unconstitutional these actions are taken. But it's a pretty extraordinary remedy for a judge at the very outset of a case, before even having heard from the government attorneys at all, to say, no, you have to stop because the states are very likely to succeed, and if the law is allowed to go into effect, this order is allowed to go into effect, there will be irreparable harm. And like I said, we articulate that as a lot of different harms.
Sandy would have jumped here to say, but who can enforce it if the president, for example, or the executive branch doesn't want to? Who can enforce it?
If they just ignore what the court says?
That's my
Who can enforce it? Vice President Vance, his comments over the weekend saying, the judges can't restrain the executive's legitimate power. Who determines what the legitimate power is? The courts. So it's not like a court saying that's not a legitimate power. That's how our constitutional system of government is set up. So there are provisions. I mean, hypothetically, a court.
Is Marbury versus Madison?
Yeah, exactly.
In question now?
I can't know. The one thing about the U.S. Supreme Court presently, certainly Chief Justice Roberts, others on the court, I think Chief Justice Roberts, before the election even, said publicly his very serious concern. He said from both sides about notions of not complying with court orders or so undermining the legitimacy of the federal judiciary. So I think the courts will not take lightly the types of threats that we're seeing to this notion of what if I just don't follow a court order. There are contempt. They could order somebody called in front of the court, the federal marshals, to pull them in, put them in jail. Who controls the federal marshals? The executive branch? I don't know. We're gonna I hope and pray that it never happens. But
I mean, it happened. It was a state, right? Obviously, but with the desegregation cases,
sure.
the governor,
they sent
of Arkansas, right,
exactly
refused to enforce the court's order, and they had to send in the National Guard.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't know that it's happened to this extreme where it's the president
right
refusing to do it. But
I have a question. This may be repetitive, but if you have parents who are undocumented and they have a child in the United States, the parents could be subject to deportation. What happens to the child? How's that handled?
Yeah, I mean, and that's that. So this goes to federal immigration policy. Certainly other administrations have taken the position that we're not going to deport those people. But that's a matter of federal law and federal policy that Vermont doesn't really have any direct control over. So
policy, not law, right?
Yeah, I don't know. Again, I'm not an immigration attorney.
Nathan, do you guys have any thoughts on that? Or I think they might have some thoughts on the question in terms of immigration law. If you don't, that's okay too.
Would you say it was a brilliant question?
Of course. It is. It's a great question. We get the question all the time. It makes sense. So there's a couple things. So if you have undocumented parents and a child is born, right now under the law, yes, they're a U.S. citizen. If the parents, let's say, are removed successfully, the option typically, and any lawyer, of course, it's tough to answer a question specifically, but what I can say is generally the two options, I don't want to say two, but mainly one is the child stays there alone, right, in the United States while the parents are removed, which has happened. It's not great. Or they would say, well, bring the child with you. So just because you have a U.S. citizen child does not, unfortunately, mean even if you're undocumented, you have the child can't even petition for you to have legal status until they were 21, but then you have problems, you'd have to show entry into the United States, so unfortunately, it's not a pathway.
Well, except for waivers.
Yeah.
Right, relief from removal where you can show extreme hardship.
Yeah.
But he can claim it at the 18-year-old.
21.
20?
Well,
21.
but
Yeah, I
can
wanna
parents
follow
file a request to gain citizenship based on being a parent of United States citizen? I thought there was a
No, they
possibility.
have to be 21.
21,
Yeah,
okay,
and
that's.
they wouldn't get citizenship, they would get a green card and then wait 5 years and then get citizenship.
Okay, sorry, Kafik.
But there is extreme circumstances, which if you could prove that the child would be, it's a baby, right? The child would be in terrible circumstances.
Extreme hardship, it's a high
It's a high one.
threshold to reach. But if you could show that, then you could get relief from removal. In a removal hearing, at first, there's a charging document that lays out the elements that the person, the respondent, is alleged to have violated. And they could concede to that and then ask for something called relief from removal. Commonly, it's going to be like political asylum, withholding of removal, but there might be something with extreme hardship and how long the parents were here. If they've been here, I think it's 10 years, and their removal would result in extreme hardship to a U.S. citizen, then the judge has the authority to grant them permanent residence, not citizenship. Permanent residence typically is the pathway to citizenship.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, I want to follow up with that. I mean, undocumented parents under the immigration law, the law says you can deport them to their origin. Undocumented babies under the new law, to where are you going to deport them? Their origin is here.
Clearly haven't thought this stuff through.
Yeah, well, so depending on the country they're nationalized, they may, instead of the old principle of jus soli, that country may operate under a principle called jus sanguinis, which is law of the blood. They may actually hold citizenship. So in the case of Colombia, maybe the baby is also Colombian, what you loosely call dual nationals. So they might be deported there. But ISIS
But
position.
maybe the parents from two different nationalities. What
So
would
it could
happen?
be, well, you have to look,
I mean,
you have to look at the different countries and their nationality. But typically ICE would be like, that's not our issue. That's your issue. Now, you could have the baby go back, you could have somebody adopt the baby. They could stay temporarily. But ICE is not gonna get involved, and ICE is not gonna put them on a government plane either, because of the liability.
Other questions?
I have a more general question. You know, Sandy always tell me, you know, there's check and balance here. And how can we get to the situation we are in today where, you know, all three branches almost are in the hands of one man or one party, if that's the case? How could it happen after 200 years of, you know, democracy, after what we were told that the Constitution was, you know, like so impenetrable that such thing could not happen?
I mean, look, I think these are just my thoughts off the cuff, but I've often thought about, in fact, I gave a talk on this, I think here with Sandy several years ago, about the rule of law. And yeah, the Constitution says what it says, it divides up the government in a certain way, it creates checks and balances, but those are just words on paper. And in the end, especially when it comes to an executive potentially just ignoring what the federal courts say, which have always been, you know, the arbiters since Marbury v. Madison of what the Constitution means and what each branch's role is, as soon as an executive stops listening to that, we're in serious shape. We have a serious problem because, yes, there's the federal marshals, but the Supreme Court of the United States, of Vermont, of any, they have no way to actually enforce their orders other than our faith in the rule of law, like the collective belief that this is how it works. When we stop believing that, or the powers that be stop believing that, well, then we got a real problem. So I think for 200 and however many years, we've all basically bought into that principle and believed in that principle, and that principle therefore exists, but it's really, really fragile. And those checks and balances, in my mind, in large part, only they come down to that collective belief of the society.
Is there a chance for reforms, for, you know, because like in other countries, people will try to, try to change the constitution because
Sure.
clearly there's a problem. What are the rules for this change?
It's very hard to amend the Constitution. Yeah.
Oh my God.
You gotta get the states to sign on, or you've got to get a certain percentage of Congress to sign on. I mean, it takes a long time. There's a reason it's only happened. What are there, 27 amendments to the U.S. Constitution, something like that? Right. So it's very, very hard to do. Unlikely to happen.
Right. Well, all officers of the United States, whether it be in the military, Secret Service, et cetera, they all, and the judiciary, they all take an oath of allegiance to support the Constitution.
Absolutely.
And the only thing we can hope for is that when, let's see, the Supreme Court orders the marshals to go arrest the president, and they're going to the White House, and they're in front of the United States Army, that the members of the United States Army have a pocket constitution that they read and say, oh yeah,
Yeah,
that's happened in other countries.
right. Sure. Hopefully, we don't obviously don't want to see that, but I do think that look, it seems to me that rule of law, those constitutional norms, those checks and balances. There's lots of countries that have the right to the freedom of speech, the right to the freedom of but a lot of times it doesn't happen that way, right? Because there isn't this norm, and I think clearly this president and this 14th Amendment executive order is an example of breaking norms, and there's some appeal to that. So let's shake things up, right? Like there's some appeal to that concept, but I think the downside here is pretty stark.
But I have to channel Sandy for a minute.
Please do.
Yeah.
All right.
You say this president.
Yeah.
Under the former president, and practically probably every president we've had in my lifetime, there was censorship.
Absolutely.
Complete violation of the First Amendment.
Absolutely. No question. And I think that's, to my mind, why it's so important that the federal courts have the stature and the role that they have. Because every executive, regardless of party, is always hungry for power. Some try to grab it more, vociferously than others, but you've got to have that check. And that check only works if we all believe in it.
Sandy would have been so happy. But for one day she couldn't say a word, but we'll clap to her first. Because she's the reason why we're here. Clap to my friend Ryan.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
And of course, this lawyer with the rock and roll style hairstyle. So please, before we go, we have an announcement. Jacob will do something, and then we'll please welcome here Grant Craigfield, long life companion of Sandy, for any announcement that you would have to share with us. Thank you.
Good evening again, and thank you so much for taking some time to come here today. This is not the moment to share about Sandy, but it is always a reminder that we should always be prepared to celebrate Sandy's life. And I really want to acknowledge all of you who have taken some time today to come and be with us today. But more importantly, acknowledge Grant's and Rosie's presence here, and also all the children she has contributed to raise and also supported so they can find a better path for their lives. And I'm sure the family here would really is appreciating all of us being here and being with them in this difficult time. In our culture, we always say that someone does not die. You move to another dimension, and those who are dead or those who are gone are always with us. And Sandy will always be with us, and therefore we will always have to work and make sure that what is just, what is right is always fulfilled, because this is what she has fought her entire life for.
I'll just make a very short comment. Thank you all so much for coming. As you can well imagine, the family is stunned and shocked and flabbergasted. This was totally unexpected. Everybody's life comes to an end, but this is absolutely not expected at all, and we're shocking for that. Sandy would be thrilled to see every one of you here individually, and I recognize most of you, and I know that to be true, as a matter of fact, from comments that she made about various people, positive comments. And also she'd be thrilled to see such a great turnout for this event. This is one of her favorite things to do. And she'd be so happy to see you here and to see you participating in such a lively, good discussion also. And finally, a lot of people have asked about a funeral or whatever. We're not going to do an official one, it's certainly not a religious one. But we do plan to announce a celebration of life for Sandy in the spring. She didn't like the cold, didn't like the winter, didn't like the snow. We'll wait till she go out and be by the lake, and everybody can have a good time. So thank you so much for coming. It means a great deal to us, and to Rosie, I think is around the corner here. Okay, so thank you.
Thank you very much. What can we say? Bonne soirée. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
How long does it take them to flight?
I don't think they did not spend